US President Donald Trump threatens higher tariffs on China. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. News came as a bit of surprise on Sunday. After weeks of praising progress in trade talks with China, US President Trump threatened to increase existing tariffs on Chinese-made imports unless Beijing moves closer to a deal by Friday. In his tweet, the president said tariffs would rise to 25% on about $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, up from the current 10%. The news left global markets shaken, with talks set to resume here in Washington on Thursday. I happened to bump into US Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin a short time ago, and this is what he said. Just to confirm, tariffs will go up if there's no deal, right?
That's correct.
Friday morning, 12 o'clock, 10% to 25%, is that correct?
That is correct.
So basically, a deal has to be done on Thursday to avoid more tariffs.
I'm not going to make any more comments, but thank you. Yes,
thank
that's
you, sir.
Correct.
So there we hear it from the horse's mouth, and for more, we turn to CGTN's Owen Fairclough, who's at the White House. Owen, bring us up to speed. We had the tweets, we saw Steven Mnuchin there. What's the latest?
And Steven Mnuchin, Nathan, is supposed to be the more dovish one, isn't he, in these negotiations, but clearly prepared to turn the screw on China, or at least carry out President Trump's orders. As you say, Trump signposting his impatience with the pace of these trade talks at the weekend and threatening to more than double the rate of tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese goods coming into the US. Remember, there were already tariffs on $50 billion. So we're talking about half the entire volume that China imports into the United States. And Trump wants to double down on that even. If he doesn't get his way with these tariffs, he said he's prepared to even put 25% tariffs on around $325 billion worth of Chinese goods. That would easily be the entire volume of Chinese imports into the US with some change left over. So dramatically escalating what we thought was potentially the end of this trade battle, with these two sides going back and forth around 10 times in the last few months, negotiating what we thought would be an end game to this trade war. Indeed, Trump himself said around a month ago he thought it would all be done within about a month. But the president has lost patience. What we understand from the US trade representative is that China was backsliding on certain commitments it had made. That's from the US side.
Yeah, and that's the US spin on it so far. Of course, we've yet to hear from the Chinese, it's still early there. But so up until President Trump's Sunday tweet, things appeared to be moving, as you said, towards an agreement. What do you think happened after that 10th round in Beijing? It's going to be round 11 if talks happen on Thursday, right?
Well, I suppose in hindsight, we can see now that those statements that the two sides put out last week when they were in Beijing negotiating were fairly terse. If you compare them to earlier statements in these negotiating rounds, when the two sides were starting to talk about the detail that they were getting into, suddenly we got these statements being very terse and neither side wanting to give away. I think it's fair to say, though, given previous rounds of negotiations, the intellectual property issue for the United States is the problem here, or at least one of them. We know that the US had been unhappy about what they accused China of forced technology transfers. That's US companies being forced to allegedly give up their trade secrets when they go into business with Chinese counterparts. And according to some reports, that had been an issue for the US. China has enacted legislation to essentially stop this. And there were concerns, according to some reports, that the US thought that China would be able to get some wiggle room on that. And that was one of the concerns. But remember, there are all sorts of thorny issues here, Nathan. We know this, subsidies and so on. And essentially, the way that China does business, we're talking about structural changes to the way China does business. And as you pointed out, the US side is giving China effectively 24 hours to try and seal the deal on Thursday when China is due to bring a delegation here. One more thought for you, Nathan. President Trump said in those tweets over the weekend that the impact of tariffs was effectively limited to costs when those goods came into China. If that's the case, why are farmers in Ohio meeting this Monday evening in an emergency to discuss potentially going out of business due to these escalating tariffs? That is a crucial constituency for US President Donald Trump. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. We're going to get into that because that's really important to interpret these tweets, because let's just say there's some erroneous information floating around. But